They called her the nurse. It was a name spoken with a mix of casual dismissal and thinly veiled contempt, a label that stuck to her like the fine, pervasive dust of the high Hindu Kush. She was a whisper in the command tent, a ghost in sterile, ill-fitting fatigues, a quiet anomaly in a world of loud, violent men. By the time they understood what she truly was, the mountain was silent, the enemy was gone, and the legend of FOB Erebus was already being written in spent brass, crimson-stained snow, and the hushed awe of the survivors who owed her their lives. They had mocked her for her quiet diligence, for the instruments they did not understand. They would come to learn that her clinic was the battlefield, her instruments were physics and fear, and her cure was absolute. The air at Forward Operating Base Erebus was a thin, cruel thing. At 14,000 feet, it was an abrasive presence in the lungs, each breath a conscious effort, a sharp reminder of the body's fragility. The base itself was an insult to engineering, a precarious collection of sand-colored HESCO barriers and prefabricated containers clinging to a windswept shoulder of rock like a desperate barnacle. It was less a fortress and more a temporary scar on the face of a hostile god. The silence here was different from any other silence. It was not an absence of noise, but a presence, a coiled entity that pressed in on the eardrums, heavy with the weight of the jagged peaks that clawed at the pale, indifferent sky. These mountains were knives, ancient and serrated, and they held the silence in their stony grasp, broken only by the incessant, whining howl of the wind and the deep, throbbing hum of the diesel generators that kept the fragile bubble of warmth and light from being extinguished. The smell was a constant layered assault, the acrid tang of generator exhaust, the cold, sterile scent of mineral rock, and an underlying metallic note that tasted of copper and altitude sickness. Inside the small, cramped container designated as the medical bay, Dr. Alara Vance was oblivious to the world of men and mountains beyond her insulated walls. She was not a nurse, but the title had been given to her by Lieutenant Commander Thorne on her first day, and it had spread through the SEAL team like a contagion. She had never bothered to correct it. Correcting it would have required an expenditure of energy for a social outcome that was, in her analysis, statistically irrelevant to her mission parameters. So, she was the nurse. Her world was one of data, of precise calibration and the elegant language of numbers. Her fingers, small and steady, moved with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic as she adjusted the delicate sensor array of a portable blood gas analyzer. She was not merely checking the machine, she was communing with it, her focus absolute, her breathing slow and measured in the oxygen-deprived air. The screen of her ruggedized tablet glowed with cascading lines of data, hemoglobin saturation percentages, arterial oxygen pressure, lactate levels for every member of Thorne's team, tracked in real time by the biometric sensors woven into their combat shirts. To the SEALs, it was just more gear. To Alara, it was a flowing river of information, a narrative of the war their bodies were waging against the unforgiving environment. She cross-referenced this physiological data with atmospheric pressure logs, solar radiation levels, and the minute seismic tremors that constantly vibrated through the mountain's granite heart. She was not just a medic, she was a cartographer of living systems in a state of extreme stress, mapping the terrain of human endurance. The clatter of boots on the gravel outside preceded the sudden, violent intrusion of noise and mass. The door to the med bay was thrown open, not pushed, and the fragile quiet was shattered. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, call sign Bull, filled the doorway, his physical presence a force of nature. He was a monument to the concept of the American warfighter, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a jaw that looked like it was hewn from the same rock as the mountains outside. His men, Alpha Team, spilled in behind him, a chaotic whirlwind of beards, tattoos, and the musk of sweat and gunpowder. They were loud, their laughter and banter echoing unnaturally in the confined space, a deliberate performance of dominance. They brought the chill of the outside with them, a palpable cold that seemed to radiate from their gear. Thorne's eyes, chips of pale blue ice, swept the small room and landed on Alara. A smirk played on his lips, a familiar expression of condescending amusement. "Still playing with your toys, nurse?" His voice boomed, a blunt instrument designed to command and belittle. "Make sure our vitals are pretty for the brass. Wouldn't want them to think we're not enjoying the view." His men chuckled, a chorus of practiced sycophancy. Alara did not look up from her tablet. Her fingers continued to swipe through data streams, her focus unwavering. She registered his presence as she would register a change in barometric pressure, a variable to be noted, but not one that required immediate interaction. Her lack of response was not defiance, it was efficiency. Engaging with Thorne's performative machismo was a non-essential task. "I trust the patrol was successful, Commander," she said, her voice quiet, almost flat. It was a statement, not a question. The data already told her the story. Elevated heart rates for a period of 23 minutes, a spike in cortisol levels inconsistent with standard patrol exertion, and trace elements of cordite residue detected by their suit sensors that hadn't been logged in their ammunition expenditure report. They had made contact, minor but unexpected, and had not reported it. Thorne's smirk tightened. He hated when she did that, answered his bluster with that cold, clinical calm. It was like punching water. "The patrol went as planned," he clipped, the lie sitting comfortably in his mouth. "We keep the ghosts on their toes." He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his massive chest. "Briefing for the push on Objective Serpent's Tooth in 30. I expect you there. High Command wants their pet scientist to observe a real operation." The word scientist was laced with the same derision as nurse. To him, she was an academic, a theorist, a liability sent from a world of clean rooms and whiteboards who had no place in his world of grit and violence. Alara finally lifted her eyes from the screen. They were a deep, startling gray, and for a moment they seemed to strip away the noise and the bluster, analyzing him with an unnerving intensity. She saw the slight tremor in his left hand, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow that the cold air should have evaporated, the fractional dilation of his pupils. He was more rattled by the unreported contact than he let on. "I will be there," she said, her gaze dropping back to her tablet. The interaction was terminated. Thorne grunted, a sound of frustration and dismissal, and turned away, leading his men toward the command tent. The medbay fell silent once more, but the silence was different now. It was charged with the residue of his presence, the lingering scent of his arrogance. Alara took a slow, deep breath, her own heart rate, which she monitored as rigorously as anyone else's, not having deviated by a single beat. She saved the patrol's sensor log, flagging the unreported cordite data with a simple, encrypted annotation: discrepancy. Then she rose, her movements fluid and deliberate, and made her way toward the briefing, a ghost moving toward a confrontation she knew was as inevitable as the setting of the sun behind the jagged peaks. The command tent was the nerve center of FOB Erebus, a canvas bubble of strained warmth against the oppressive cold. A large holographic map table dominated the center of the room, its soft blue light casting long, dancing shadows on the grim faces of the men assembled around it. The air was thick with the smells of stale coffee, damp gear, and nervous energy. Thorn stood at the head of the table, a pointer in his hand, radiating an aura of absolute authority. He moved with the confident swagger of a man who had never had his dominance seriously questioned. Alara slipped into the tent and stood near the entrance, a small, unassuming figure in the corner, her presence easily ignored. She preferred it that way. Observation was pure from the periphery. Thorn began the briefing, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. He outlined the plan to assault Serpent's Tooth, a notorious enemy observation post perched on a high, treacherous ridge. The plan was a textbook SEAL operation, a two-pronged assault under the cover of darkness, one team providing suppressive fire while the other flanked and overwhelmed the position. It was aggressive, direct, and relied entirely on speed and violence of action. It was a plan born of 1,000 similar operations in deserts and jungles and urban sprawls across the globe. Alpha Team, my element, we'll take the direct route up the eastern face, Thorn declared, tapping the glowing map with his pointer. Fast and hard. Bravo will set up a support by fire position here, on the opposing ridge, and keep their heads down. Standard procedure. Questions? The tent was silent. The men knew the drill. It was muscle memory, practiced and perfected. But Alara's eyes were not on the route Thorn had indicated. They were on a different part of the map, a seemingly impassable network of ravines and narrow gorges to the south of the objective, marked on the topographical display as the Zarthash Traverse. It was a place standard tactical doctrine would dismiss as non-viable for any kind of military movement. She took a single step forward. The slight movement was enough to draw Thorn's attention. His eyes narrowed. Something to add, nurse? The question was a challenge, a dare. Alara's voice, when it came, was quiet, but cut through the low hum of the tense electronics with crystalline clarity. Commander, your proposed route of assault places Alpha Team in a fatal funnel. A low murmur rippled through the assembled SEALs. Thorn's face darkened, a flush of anger rising up his thick neck. Explain yourself, he commanded, his voice tight. The geological composition of the eastern face is primarily schist and gneiss, Alara began, her tone that of a lecturer delivering a factual report. It's acoustically reflective. The wind patterns in this sector, particularly after dusk, when the thermal inversion layer descends, create a Venturi effect. Any sound produced on that approach, boots on gravel, gear shifting, even heavy breathing, will be amplified and channeled directly toward the summit. You won't be a quiet approach. You'll be a symphony. She gestured toward her tablet, which she held in one hand. Furthermore, my analysis of the past 72 hours of passive acoustic sensor data, cross-referenced with local informant chatter, indicates the enemy has shifted their primary listening posts. They are not where you expect them to be. They are using the Zarthash Traverse. Thorn let out a short, barking laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound. The Traverse? That's a goat path. It's impassable for a fully kitted team. You're telling me you know more about enemy tactics than my intel guys because of some microphones and a weather report? I am telling you what the data indicates, Alara replied, her expression unreadable. The enemy is local. They understand this terrain in a way we do not. They are using it to their advantage. They will not be on the summit waiting for a frontal assault. They will be in the traverse, waiting for you to become decisively engaged on the eastern face, and then they will flank you. They will use your own operational doctrine against you. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suddenly tense air. The data indicates a 92.7% probability of heavy contact and catastrophic mission failure if you proceed with the current plan. The numbers are neutral, Commander. They do not have an ego. The final sentence was a perfectly aimed dart, and it found its mark. Thorne's face contorted with rage. He took a step toward her, his bulk seeming to suck the air out of the room. He was inches from her, towering over her small frame, a physical embodiment of indignant authority. "Let me be perfectly clear, Doctor," he spat, finally using her correct title, but twisting it into an insult. "Your job is to monitor heart rates and tell us if we need to drink more water. My job is to kill bad guys and break their toys. You are a guest here, a civilian tourist with a government credit card. You will not question my orders or my tactics in front of my men ever again. We stick to what works. We stick to the plan. Leave the fighting to the men with the guns." His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "Are we understood?" The entire tent held its breath. The other SEALs looked on, some with smirks, others with a flicker of unease. They were watching a public execution of credibility. Ilara did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. Her own physiological state remained a placid C. Her heart rate was a steady 62 beats per minute. His, she noted from the data still streaming to her tablet, had just crested 130. He was angry, but he was also afraid. Her data had unnerved him, and his only defense was bluster and rank. "Your emotional state is elevated, Commander," she stated, the observation delivered with the detached interest of a mechanic noting an engine running hot. "It may be impacting your tactical judgment." It was a checkmate. She had not argued, had not defied his order. She had simply made a medical observation, perfectly within her purview as the team's nurse. But in the context of the confrontation, it was a devastating countermove. It framed his anger not as righteous authority, but as a clinical symptom of weakness. Thorne stared at her, his jaw working silently. For a moment, it looked as if he might strike her. The air crackled with the possibility. Then, with a visible effort of will, he reined himself in. He couldn't afford to be seen losing control, especially after she had just pointed it out. He spun on his heel, his face a mask of cold fury. "Briefing's over," he snapped at the room. "Gear up. We move in 1 hour." He stormed out of the tent, his men shuffling awkwardly in his wake. One of them, a younger sniper named Trace, whose real name was CPO Kenji Tanaka, lingered for a moment. He met Ilara's gaze, a question in his eyes. He was the team's best marksman, a man who understood wind and distance and the cold physics of a bullet's flight. He had heard the logic in her words, the familiar ring of hard science. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement. He saw it, held her gaze for a second longer, and then disappeared into the biting wind outside. Ilara remained in the empty tent, the blue light of the map painting her in its ethereal glow. She looked at the Zarthash Traverse, a place of 92.7% certainty, and began her own preparations. The commander had given his orders. The data, however, had given its prophecy. The crisis, when it came, was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating strangulation. Alpha Team moved out as planned, their forms swallowed by the deep twilight that bled across the jagged horizon. From the small makeshift operations center within the command tent, Alara watched their progress. She was a silent sentinel surrounded by glowing screens, a priestess of data streams. One monitor displayed the blue-on-black icons of the seals moving up the eastern face of Serpent's Tooth. Another showed their vitals, a dozen heartbeats pulsing in a steady, rhythmic cadence. A third was dedicated to her own system, a web of passive acoustic sensors she had tasked satellites to retarget, creating a listening network that spanned the entire valley. The air in the tent was cold, but she felt a different kind of chill settle deep in her bones. It was the cold certainty of watching a mathematical proof unfold toward its grim, inevitable conclusion. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a ghost in the machine. A faint, anomalous echo appeared on her acoustic display, originating from the Zarthash Traverse. It was a whisper, a sound that should not have been there, a brief, metallic scrape that the comms officer listening to the open channel dismissed as wind. But Alara's system analyzed its spectral signature, non-ferrous metal against igneous rock, a climbing carabiner, or the stock of a rifle. She marked its location on her private topographical map. Then came another, 200 meters to the east, and another. They were moving into position, a net being drawn tight. They weren't on the summit as Thorn had boasted. They were exactly where she said they would be. Then the ambush was sprung. It was not the chaotic, overwhelming firepower she had expected. It was something far more insidious, more intelligent. The first shot was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the rock face a dozen feet above Thorn's head. The 7.62 millimeter round struck the schist, and instead of a simple ricochet, it shattered a dinner plate-sized chunk of the brittle rock. The shard, weighing perhaps 20 pounds, spun through the air and slammed into the seal directly behind Thorn, striking his helmet with a sickening crack. The man went down without a sound, his icon on her screen flashing a sudden, critical red. A severe concussion, a possible spinal injury. Panic crackled over the comms. "Contact! Contact! Man down!" Then the real attack began. It was not a volley of suppressive fire. It was a series of single, perfectly aimed shots. They weren't targeting center mass. They were targeting equipment. A round slammed into the radio of the team's comm specialist, shattering it into a spray of plastic and wires. Another punctured a water bladder on a seal's back, the precious fluid gushing out onto the frozen rock. A third shot, impossibly precise, hit the night vision scope of another operator, the device exploding in a shower of green-tinged sparks. It was a systematic deconstruction of the team's ability to fight and survive. They were being dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy who understood their gear as well as they did. Thorn's voice, a roar of fury and confusion, bellowed over the net. "Where is it coming from? Light 'em up! Suppressive fire! Sector 3! His men responded, their training taking over. The night was torn apart by the roar of their M4s, tracers sketching frantic, desperate lines into the darkness. But they were shooting at ghosts. The enemy's muzzle flashes were invisible, their positions perfectly concealed within the acoustic dead zones of the complex rock formations. Thorn's orthodox solution, overwhelming firepower, was completely ineffective. It was worse than ineffective. It was a waste of precious ammunition, and it served only to pinpoint their exact locations for the unseen shooters. "Bravo, team! We need SBF! Pour it on the ridge!" Thorn screamed into his handset, his voice ragged with the first notes of desperation. The reply from the other ridge was grim. Negative, Bull. We can't get a bead. They're dug in too deep. We can't see them. Thorn tried to call for air support, his last resort, the hammer he always relied on. Erebus, this is Alpha. I need a gun run on Serpent's Tooth. Danger close. The comms officer in the tent with Alara responded, his voice tight. Negative, Alpha. Weather's moved in. Ceilings dropped to 500 feet. Air is a no-go. Repeat, air is a no-go. The failure of orthodoxy was complete. Thorn's entire tactical playbook, superior firepower, flanking maneuvers, air support, had been rendered useless in minutes. He had led his men into a perfectly designed trap, a killing box engineered by an enemy that fought not with brute force, but with a deep, intimate knowledge of the environment. The mountain itself had become their enemy. The team was pinned down, their equipment being systematically destroyed, their ammunition dwindling, and a man grievously injured. They were bleeding out on the side of a cold, dark rock, and their leader, the man of bluster and certainty, had no answers. His voice on the comms was no longer a confident roar. It was the ragged, panicked rasp of a man watching his world crumble around him. The silence between the enemy's methodical shots grew longer, more terrifying. They were being toyed with, dissected by an unseen, hyper-competent foe. The crisis was absolute. In the humming silence of the command tent, a profound shift was occurring. Authority, like energy, does not vanish. It merely transfers. As Thorn's control evaporated into the cold mountain air, a new center of gravity began to assert itself. Alara Vance stood before her wall of screens, her posture unchanged, her expression as calm and placid as a frozen lake. She tracked the incoming rounds not as attacks, but as data points. Each impact, each ricochet, was a sonar ping in the three-dimensional acoustic map she was building in her mind and on her system. The enemy was invisible, but their bullets were telling her everything she needed to know. The angle of impact on the shattered radio, the Doppler shift of the round that had punctured the water bladder, the precise micro-delay between the supersonic crack and the report of the rifle, it was all information. The comms crackled with the sound of Thorn's labored breathing, a harsh, grating sound that spoke of fear and failure. Bravo, I need a diversion. Anything. We can't move. His voice was broken. The bluster was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a man out of his depth. Into that void of leadership, Alara's voice emerged. It was not loud, but it cut through the static and the panic with the chilling precision of a scalpel. She keyed the primary command channel, bypassing the local net. Bull, this is Vance. Cease fire. All elements, cease fire and conserve ammunition. I have a solution. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute silence on the network. The very idea was preposterous. The nurse, the civilian, giving orders in the middle of a catastrophic firefight. In the tent, the young comms officer stared at her, his mouth agape. Thorn's reply was a choked whisper. Vance, what the hell are you talking about? You have lost fire superiority, your position is compromised, and your tactical options have been exhausted, Alara stated. Not with malice, but with the dispassionate finality of a diagnosis. You have approximately 38 minutes of combat viability before ammunition depletion and hypothermia render your team ineffective. Do you have an alternative course of action with a higher probability of success? There was no answer. There was none to give. He was beaten, and she had just read him the scorecard. Negative, Commander, she continued, her voice assuming a new tone. It was no longer observational. It was instructional. Therefore, you will follow my lead. She did not wait for his consent. Authority was not something he could give her now. It was something she was simply taking. "Trace, what is your position relative to the main granite spire northwest of your location?" Her choice to address the sniper directly was a calculated masterstroke. She was bypassing the compromised command structure and speaking directly to the team's most analytical member. For a moment, there was only static. Then a new voice, calm and professional, cut through. "Vance, this is Trace. I'm on the lower eastern ledge, pinned behind a schist outcrop. Spire is at my 10 o'clock, approximate range 800 meters. Trace, Kenji Tanaka, had made his choice. He heard the same cold, irrefutable logic in her voice that he used to calculate his own impossible shots. In a world that had descended into chaos, her calm certainty was the only solid ground. The rest of the team, hearing their best shooter comply, followed his lead. The psychological dam broke. Allegiance flowed from the failing commander to the quiet woman with the plan. "Trace," Elara's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I need you to perform a calculated ricochet shot. I am uploading the target package to your HUD now." On the small display inside Trace's scope, a complex set of numbers and a glowing red reticle appeared, superimposed over the dark landscape. But the reticle wasn't on an enemy. It was on a seemingly random patch of bare rock on a cliff face, hundreds of meters away from the direction of the enemy fire. "Vance, that's a negative target," Trace reported, confused. "There's nothing there." "That is correct," Elara replied. "The rock formation at those coordinates has a specific resonant frequency. Your round will not be for effect on target. It will be a sonic illuminator. The returning echo, processed through our comms network, will allow me to triangulate the precise location of every shooter in the traverse. You are my tuning fork, Trace. Send the note." A beat of silence. Then, "Solid copy, Vance." Sending the note. The single, sharp crack of Trace's high-velocity round echoed across the valley, a lone voice in the darkness. Elara watched her screens, her eyes scanning the cascading waves of data from the acoustic sensors. The sound wave from the bullet's impact radiated outward, a perfect ripple in a dark pond. It washed over the hidden enemy positions, and the echo, infinitesimally faint, returned. Her system caught it. On her holographic map, a series of red dots bloomed into existence, appearing as if from nowhere within the tangled maze of the Zarthash Traverse. 7 of them. The ghosts now had names. "Triangulation complete," she announced, her voice devoid of triumph. "I have them all." Without another word, she turned from the console. She walked past the stunned comms officer to the sealed Pelican case in the corner of the tent, the one marked Medical Equipment, Extreme Environment Kit. She opened it with a series of quick, efficient snaps of the latches. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a defibrillator or a trauma kit. It was the disassembled form of a Nemesis Arms Vanquish, a takedown, multi-caliber sniper system known for its almost mythical precision. It was Trace's spare, the one he had reluctantly left at the FOB. With the same detached, methodical grace she used to calibrate her instruments, she assembled the rifle, the heavy barrel locked into the receiver with a solid, satisfying clack. The bolt slid home with the oiled whisper of perfectly machined steel. She attached the Horus Vision scope, its lens the size of a small telescope, and slotted a magazine loaded with .338 Lapua Magnum rounds into the well. The entire process took her less than 45 seconds. She slung the heavy rifle over her shoulder, picked up a spare magazine, and walked to the tent flap. The comms officer could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming nurse with the cold, professional lethality she now embodied. "Keep the channel open," she said, without looking back. "Tell Alpha Team to stay down and maintain absolute silence. The solution is in progress." She stepped out of the tent and into the biting, all-consuming cold of the mountain night. She climbed. The wind was a physical blow, a solid wall of freezing air that tore at her fatigues and tried to steal the breath from her lungs. Ilara moved with a steady, relentless rhythm, her slight frame belying the strength in her legs. She was not a seal, conditioned for explosive power. She was an endurance athlete, her body a perfectly efficient machine, honed by years of high-altitude mountaineering. She climbed toward a rocky promontory on the edge of the FOB, a spot she had identified on her first day as the optimal firing position on the entire plateau. It offered the best possible view of the Serpent's Tooth and the Zarthash Traverse, and its granite base would provide an unshakable platform for the rifle. She reached the position, a small, flat ledge shielded from the worst of the wind by a massive boulder. The world spread out before her, a chaotic jumble of black and gray under the faint starlight, a landscape of abstract, hostile shapes. She unslung the rifle and deployed its bipod, the metal legs grating on the rock. She lay down behind it, becoming one with the stone, the cold seeping into her through the thin material of her clothes. She did not feel it. Her mind was already elsewhere, running the complex equations that would turn physics into death. Through the powerful scope, the world resolved into a grainy, monochrome tableau. She keyed her comms unit, her voice a low murmur carried on the wind. "Trace, confirm enemy disposition." "7 shooters, Vance," his voice came back, tight with awe. "Your map is accurate. They're dug in like ticks, impossible shots." "The word impossible is a subjective assessment of incomplete data," she replied coolly. She settled the rifle stock into her shoulder, her cheek finding its familiar place on the cold metal. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropping into the low 50s. The world narrowed to the circle of the scope. Target 1 acquired. The first target was the most difficult, a shooter nestled in a narrow crevice nearly 1,800 meters away. A direct shot was impossible. A wall of rock shielded him. But Ilara wasn't looking at the shooter. She was looking at a patch of ice-glazed granite 50 feet above and to the right of his position. Her tablet, propped beside the rifle, displayed a dizzying array of calculations. Wind speed at 3 distinct atmospheric layers between her and the target. Coriolis effect for that latitude and firing azimuth. Spin drift of the 300-grain bullet and the precise angle of incidence needed for the ricochet. She even factored in the terminal velocity drop and the resulting change in the bullet's kinetic energy to ensure the ricochet wouldn't just wound, but would maintain enough force to be lethal. It was not marksmanship. It was applied physics at the highest level. She adjusted the scope's elevation and windage knobs with delicate, precise clicks. Her finger rested on the trigger. Her mind went silent, the torrent of numbers resolving into a single, perfect point of certainty. Now. She exhaled, and in the still point at the end of her breath, she pressed the trigger. The rifle boomed, a deep, concussive roar that was instantly snatched away by the wind. The recoil was a solid, authoritative punch into her shoulder, which she absorbed without flinching. For a heart-stopping 2.5 seconds, the bullet was a ghost, an unseen prayer sent into the void. Through the scope, she saw a tiny, almost invisible spark as the round struck the ice-glazed rock. Seconds later, Trace's voice crackled in her ear, breathless. "Target 1 down. My God, he's down. How did you—" "Target 2 acquired," Alara said, already working the bolt, the spent brass casing ejecting with a metallic flick, arcing through the air before tinkling onto the rock beside her. The second shooter was easier, a direct line of sight, but the distance was extreme, over 2,000 meters. The challenge here was the wind. It was a treacherous, shifting river of air, flowing in different directions at different altitudes. Her sensors gave her the data, but it was her intuition, her deep, almost preternatural understanding of high-altitude atmospherics that allowed her to interpret it. She held her crosshairs not on the man, but on a patch of empty air, 12 feet to his left and 6 feet above his head. A ghost aiming at a ghost. Boom! The rifle roared again. The wait was longer this time, a stretched thread of silence. Then the distant figure in her scope simply collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut. "Target 2 down," Trace confirmed, his voice hushed, reverent. One by one, she moved through the targets. Each shot was a unique problem, a distinct equation to be solved. For the third, she had to wait for a precise 5-second window, when the wind speed in 2 separate gorges momentarily canceled each other out. For the fourth, she fired not at the man, but at a heavy icicle hanging above his position, the impact shattering the ice and sending a 100-pound dagger of frozen water down onto the unsuspecting sniper. It was brutal, efficient, and utterly brilliant. The fifth and sixth targets were taken out with 2 shots in less than 10 seconds, a testament to her fluid mastery of the rifle. Only one remained, the leader. He was in the deepest part of the traverse, completely shielded from any direct or indirect fire, but he was using a radio, a powerful one. "Vance, target 7 is a no-go," Trace reported. "He's behind a solid wall of granite. There's no shot." "There is always a shot," Alara murmured, more to herself than to him. She changed her position slightly, recalculating. The enemy leader was transmitting, trying to rally his broken team. The radio waves themselves were the key. She triangulated his position not just with acoustics, but with the faint electromagnetic signature of his comms unit. He was deep in a cave, but the cave had a fissure, a thin, almost invisible crack in the rock ceiling. "Trace," she commanded. "Fire 1 round at my mark. Do not aim to hit, aim to suppress. I need him to stay in one place for 10 seconds. "Copy," Trace replied. The crack of his rifle echoed a moment later. Alara took her final shot. It was the most audacious of all. The .338 round flew into the darkness, not at the enemy, but high above him. It entered the narrow fissure in the rock, a shot that was less than an inch in tolerance. The bullet did not hit the man. It struck the back wall of the small cave he was hiding in. The kinetic energy of the massive round, unable to penetrate the thick granite, was transferred into the rock itself. The result was a concussive wave, a localized shock wave that turned the small cave into a biological pressure cooker. The overpressure would be immense, catastrophic to the soft tissues of the human body. A profound silence fell over the mountain. It was a new kind of silence, deeper and more absolute than before. The whining of the wind was the only sound that remained. The threat was not just neutralized, it was erased. The ghosts of the Zarthash Traverse had been exorcised by a single, quiet woman and the immutable laws of physics. In the command tent, the comms officer listened to the sequence of 7 booming shots, followed by Trace's stunned confirmations, and then nothing. On the screen, The icons of Alpha Team were no longer flashing red. They were static, safe. On the side of the mountain, Thorn and his men lay in the frozen dark, listening to the echoes fade. They had been spectators to their own salvation, delivered by a weapon they couldn't see and a mind they couldn't comprehend. The nurse had ended the fight. The mountain was quiet. The aftermath was a study in stunned silence. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the eastern peaks, painting the snow in hues of bruised purple and fragile pink, when the first secure satellite communication link chirped to life in the command tent. The young comms officer, his face pale and drawn from the night's events, answered it. A face appeared on the main screen, stern and etched with the deep lines of a career spent making impossible decisions. It was Admiral Hayes, commander of Special Operations Command, Pacific. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the tent. He did not ask for Thorn. He did not ask for a sitrep from the ranking officer on site. His voice was calm, but carried an undeniable weight of authority that dwarfed anything Thorn had ever projected. "Get me Ghost," he said simply. The comms officer fumbled with his headset. "Sir, I don't know who that is." Just then, Alara entered the tent. She moved with the same quiet deliberation as always, though her fatigues were dusted with rock powder and her face was smudged with cordite. She placed the Nemesis rifle on the table with a soft, heavy thud, its metal still cold from the night air. She walked to the console and looked up at the Admiral's face on the screen. "Ghost online," she said, her voice a flat, factual statement. Admiral Hayes nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his features. "Report, Doctor." The use of her title, Doctor, hung in the air like a detonation. The comms officer stared. Thorn, who had just entered the tent, his face a mask of exhaustion and humiliation, froze in his tracks. He had come to resume command, to piece together his shattered authority. Instead, he was confronted with this new, incomprehensible reality. Alara delivered her report. It was concise, clinical, and devoid of any emotion or embellishment. She detailed the enemy's strategy, the failure of the initial plan, her acoustic triangulation method, and the subsequent neutralization of all 7 hostile targets. She did not mention Thorn's insubordination or his public challenge to her analysis. The data of his failure spoke for itself. "Alpha Team is secure," she concluded. "1 casualty, non-life-threatening, requiring medevac. The objective is clear. Mission accomplished." Hayes listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted, finding Thorn, who was standing stiffly by the tent flap, a ghost in his own command center. "Lieutenant Commander Thorn." The Admiral's voice was like a glacier, cold and immensely powerful. "Your performance and judgment have been found wanting. Your failure to heed qualified intelligence resulted in the near-total loss of your team. Your command of Alpha Team is hereby revoked, effective immediately, pending a full board of inquiry. You will be confined to quarters until your transport arrives. Is that understood?" Thorn's face, already pale, went ashen. The public stripping of his command, the utter humiliation in front of a subordinate officer, and the woman he had relentlessly mocked, was a blow more devastating than any bullet. His entire world, built on the foundations of rank, reputation, and aggression, had been demolished. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. All he could manage was a choked, barely audible, "Yes, sir." Dr. Vance is in operational control of FOB Erebus until the recovery team arrives, Hayes continued, his eyes still locked on Thorne. The message was clear. The person you dismissed as a nurse, the woman you called a liability, is now your commanding officer. Thorne looked at Alara. He saw her not as the nurse, but as something alien, something terrifying. He saw the architect of his ruin, a woman who wielded data like a weapon and logic like a sword. He gave a jerky, almost spastic nod, turned without another word, and stumbled out of the tent, a broken man disappearing into the cold morning light. With Thorne gone, Hayes finally allowed a hint of warmth into his voice. "The rest of you," he said to the comms officer and other staff who had witnessed the exchange. "Listen to her. She is Dr. Alara Vance, the lead designer of the Acoustic Dominance and Environmental Warfare Initiative. She is a DARPA asset, the foremost military expert on nonlinear conflict theory. Her nurse cover was her own idea, designed to allow her to collect unbiased physiological and environmental data during a live combat deployment without the observer effect of her actual rank and position interfering. That rifle," he nodded at the nemesis on the table, "is her design. She was there to test her systems. It appears the test was a resounding success." The revelation settled over the room, recontextualizing everything. The quiet woman in the corner, the one they had ignored and patronized, was not just a scientist. She was a weapon, a new kind of soldier for a new kind of war. A war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with algorithms, acoustics, and the cold, hard math of the physical world. Her authority wasn't granted by a rank on her collar. It was an inherent property of her staggering competence. The legend of the ghost of Erebus was born in that moment, not of myth, but of undeniable, terrifying fact. In the hours that followed, a new order settled over FOB Erebus. It was a quiet, efficient, and deeply unnerving order. The remaining SEALs of Bravo Team and the survivors of Alpha moved with a hushed reverence. The boisterous confidence was gone, replaced by a wide-eyed respect that bordered on fear. They followed Alara's directives without question, their movements quick and precise. She coordinated the medevac for the injured SEAL, organized the recovery of the enemy bodies for intelligence purposes, and began compiling her final after-action report, her fingers flying across the keys of her tablet with the same dispassionate speed she had used to calculate firing solutions. She showed no pleasure in her victory, no satisfaction in Thorne's downfall. To her, it was not a personal triumph. It was simply the logical outcome of a sequence of events. Thorne's ego was a flawed variable in a critical equation. She had corrected for the variable. The problem was now solved. She returned to her work as if the night's harrowing events had been nothing more than a complex simulation. The men watched her, trying to understand the mind behind the calm gray eyes, and failing completely. She was an entity beyond their comprehension, a force of nature that had passed through their lives and irrevocably altered them. Later that day, as the sun began its descent and the shadows of the great peaks grew long once more, Trace found her. She was not in the command tent or the med bay. She was back on the rocky promontory where she had made the shots, sitting with her legs crossed, staring out at the vast, silent landscape. The Nemesis rifle was disassembled on a canvas cloth before her, each component being cleaned with meticulous, almost reverent care. He approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the profound stillness that surrounded her. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply stood a few feet away, watching her work. He understood the ritual of cleaning a weapon, the intimate connection between a shooter and their tool. But watching her, he realized she was not just cleaning a rifle, she was communing with it, her hands moving over the machined steel with the same familiarity a geologist might have with a piece of ancient rock. Finally, he cleared his throat. "The recovery team found them," he said, his voice low. "All 7, exactly where you said they'd be." Alara didn't look up. The data was accurate. "The shot on target 4, Trace said, unable to keep the question out of his voice. "The icicle. You planned that. You saw that as a viable option." "It was the most efficient solution," she replied, wiping a thin film of oil onto the bolt. "It used the environment as the primary kinetic instrument. Lower ammunition expenditure, minimal risk of overpenetration." Trace shook his head in disbelief. He, one of the best snipers in the world, thought in terms of windage and elevation. She thought in terms of geological instability and environmental physics. He was playing checkers. She was playing a form of three-dimensional chess he was only just beginning to perceive. He didn't offer praise or thanks. He knew instinctively that such things were meaningless to her. Instead, he offered the only thing he could, a gesture of shared understanding, of professional respect. He held out a battered metal tin. "Bore solvent," he said. "It's a custom mix, better for the cold, doesn't gum up." Alara paused in her work. She looked up at him, her gray eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw something other than cold analysis in them. It was a flicker of acknowledgement, a brief spark of connection between two masters of the same lonely craft. She reached out and took the tin. "Thank you, Kenji," she said, using his real name. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but for Trace, it was more profound than any medal. It was an acceptance into a world he had not known existed. He nodded, the unspoken conversation complete, and left her there, a solitary figure communing with her rifle as the mountain held its breath around them. The next morning, a single, unmarked Black Hawk helicopter descended from the sky, its blades beating a rhythmic tattoo against the thin air. It did not land in the main LZ, but settled on a small, flat area near the promontory, away from the main base. Alara was already there, waiting. She carried only a single pack. The Nemesis rifle, back in its Pelican case, had been left for Trace. She climbed aboard without a backward glance. She had no parting words for the men she had saved, no final pronouncements. Her purpose at FOB Erebus was fulfilled. The data had been collected, the hypothesis tested and proven. She was a force of logic, and her work here was done. As the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the valley, she did not look out the window at the jagged peaks or the tiny scar of the base below. She was already looking at her tablet, analyzing the data from the helicopter's engine vibrations. Her mind already on the next equation, the next problem, the next battlefield. She had arrived as a whisper, a dismissed ghost in the machine of war. She left as a legend, a chilling story to be told in hushed tones in briefing rooms and forward bases for years to come. They would speak of the nurse who became a phantom, the quiet scientist who dismantled an enemy force with nothing but a rifle, and the cold, hard truths of the physical world. She was not a warrior in the way they understood. She did not conquer the mountain with force or fury. She had simply listened to it, understood its language of wind and rock and sound, and taught it to speak with a voice of pure, terrifying precision. And for the handful of men who had been there to hear it, the world and the nature of warfare itself would never be the same. Dead